Welcome back to the channel, everybody. Today I'm going to talk about how I was wrong about the stabilizer disconnect on this new Landcruiser that will be coming to the US market, aka the new Landcruiser coming to America boasts a front stabilizer bar disconnect. And previously I said this was simply e-KDSS, which has been around for years now on the Landcruiser 300. I said that's just e-KDSS in the front. Well, I was wrong, and it's actually a little bit worse. So let's get right into it. Here is the new stabilizer disconnect mechanism that's going to be on the Landcruiser 250, aka the Landcruiser coming to America, aka the Landcruiser Prado in the world market. I know that was a little bit of a mouthful, but we'll focus here on the stabilizer disconnect, and we're going to talk about how this is different from e-KDSS that is going to be on your Lexus GX550 and has also been on the Landcruiser 300 since it debuted a few years ago in the world market. So let's watch and talk about how these two systems are quite different from each other. So Toyota calls it stabilizer disconnect mechanism. A lot of people got excited and said, oh, Toyota is putting a sway bar disconnect on their new Landcruiser, not realizing Toyota's had a sway bar disconnect on their vehicle since 2009 with the e-KDSS system. And as we'll see later, it's a superior system. So if we zoom in here, we can see that, again, the SDM system uses a more typical type of sway bar disconnect. There's a mechanical coupling there, and that's essentially what's being disconnected. It's being coupled and decoupled electrically. And this is essentially the bargain e-KDSS system, as we'll discuss here in a moment. And again, it's only on the front. But we'll see that the main takeaway here is simplicity and cost savings, because the system here is highlighted in red, and you're going to have this mechanical disconnect in the center that is going to disconnect the center, which effectively disconnects the sway bar. Again, highlighted in blue here, and it will only disconnect the front sway bar. So hang on, you're going to see that the comparison here to e-KDSS in a moment. You can hit a free button or lock button. It is a bit of a gimmick because the system will lock you out, I believe, over 30 miles an hour. So even if you hit disconnect, it's only going to work at low speeds, which is exactly what KDSS and e-KDSS already do. But you can hit free and unfree at your will, and it's going to allow for articulation off-road. Now, how much articulation versus e-KDSS? Presumably exactly the same. So you're going to get full front articulation relative to the e-KDSS system. Or at least as far as articulation off-road, there's not going to be an advantage between either system. But, as we'll see later, by the way, they're showing you the difference in articulation. The wheels meet the road on this stabilizer disconnect system. But we're going to see in a minute why the e-KDSS system is better both off-road and both on-road. As you can see, there's something missing in the rear, and that's a rear a rear SDM. They didn't put it on the rear for cost savings. So the Landcruiser 250 does have the front disconnect, a simplified front disconnect, but nothing in the rear, as you see there. And so this is a little bit dramatic here, but you want articulation off-road so the wheels can hit the surface instead of tossing you into the surface. So it will help with off-road driver comfort. So again, they're showing you on road that you can't, once you hit 30 miles an hour, it's going to lock itself back up automatically. So you can't drive on road with the sway bar on. There's a 30 mile per hour lockout, so it'll stiffen the bar once you get back on pavement or once you get up to speed here. So what's the real sway bar disconnect? Well, this is at e-KDSS. Now this system is going to be on the Lexus GX 550 e-KDSS. And as we see here, there is a front sway bar disconnect in the front and the rear. And additionally, the front gets 2 cylinders, which we'll talk about in a second, why that's important, why that differs from the SDM system that you just saw. But essentially, e-KDSS disconnects the sway bar at the end links using these hydraulic cylinders. They simply are filled with hydraulic fluid, and as you can see here, when the fluid is allowed to, they're pistons essentially, instead of solid end links. And when the fluid is allowed to move freely, the sway bar can articulate. And when it's locked, as you see here, it acts as a solid sway bar. It locks it just like a tractor or backhoe or a crane locks its hydraulic cylinder. Fluid is not compressible in a cylinder, so once it's locked, it acts like a solid member, aka a solid sway bar end link, so the sway bar will be firm. But let's talk about unlocking, and you can see here this articulation. So this, again, e-KDSS is on the flagship Landcruiser 300 and the much more pricey Lexus GX 550. You can clearly see, compared to the Toyota SDM or sway bar disconnect mechanism that we just saw in the Landcruiser 250, that it's a much more complex system. The big thing is you get it on the rear too, and of course you want maximum articulation front and rear. There's no situation where you don't want more articulation or omitting it on the rear. I think Toyota, again, just did that on the Landcruiser 250 for cost savings, because this is a much more complex system. So you're going to get the same amount, if not more, articulation, because Toyota/Lexus boast that it's increased by 110 millimeters, which is huge over the last KDSS system. So you get huge articulation on this e-KDSS. Now, how much does this system in the front compare to articulation to the Toyota SDM system we just saw? Who knows? It hasn't been measured yet. It's safe to say that they both do the same exact thing when off-road in the front. But as we can see here on the rear, you have a rear cylinder back here, and this rear cylinder allows fluid to move freely when it's in the free position, and you're going to have more rear articulation. This we can argue, and again, we can't prove this without actual numbers, but we can argue that logically this GX 550 and the Landcruiser 300 is going to have more rear flex or articulation versus the Landcruiser 250 that will be coming to America, simply because there is a rear disconnect system here. So that's safe to presume, but again, we can't prove it. The only thing that might change that is if Toyota decides to leave the rear sway bar off the Landcruiser 250 completely. Again, Toyota showcasing the increased articulation, again 110 millimeters, increased from the previous generation KDSS system, which again has been around since 2009. I know I keep repeating myself, but Toyota has had sway bar disconnects front and rear with KDSS since 2009. It is not new. And so you're seeing a similar demonstration here of the benefits of articulation. They're slammed back and forth because they're falling. If you don't have articulation, you fall instead of the bumps, instead of float over the bumps. All right, let's talk about the important part of, or the interesting part, when it comes to on-road driving on the front. Now, the main difference here is you can see there's 2 cylinders. So let's just focus on the front. We already know that the rear has more articulation versus the Toyota SDM system. So how does e-KDSS in the front, how is it better than the Landcruiser SDM system on the front? Well, as you can see here, there's 2 cylinders this time. The old KDSS only had 1 collapsible cylinder. This one has 2 collapsible cylinders, so the independent can be disconnected. The sway bar can be disconnected front to rear independently of each other, so it can keep the rear locked or on, or the front on or locked, or whatever, vice versa. The point is they act independently, free or lock. In addition, and this is the interesting part, is there's 2 cylinders on the front. So that effectively means that these 2 cylinders can change their relative height independently of what's going on in the rear, and that means they can adjust the height of the end links. It's basically by pumping more or less fluid in here and keeping it that way, they can change the height of these two cylinders independent of the rear. That essentially acts as an adjustable height end link. You've seen on race cars and any modified on or off road cars, they get these adjustable height end links, and they can adjust the height of the end links here. Well, presumably this e-KDSS system now, with two collapsible cylinders on the front here, we can presume that since these can change height essentially and act like adjustable end links. What does that mean to you? Superior on-road feel. And this is where the e-KDSS system shines, because since it can disconnect front and rear completely, they can put this massive front and rear sway bar. So when you're on road, you get the flattest feeling you can imagine in a car of this class and size and weight. In fact, the current generation Lexus GX 460 has the largest front and rear sway bars of any vehicle in this class, simply because it has the ability to disconnect them completely when off-road. So this KDSS system, insofar as the front goes compared to the Toyota SDM system, it's going to come down to the fine-tuning of the on-road feel here, because it can disconnect completely, or it can play around with the height of these cylinders, which changes the rate of how your front sway bar acts. Now, that might not be important to many people. They may think, well, who cares? I just want the sway bar to disconnect and I'm happy. And I guess that would be fair. That's great. But I'm going to tell you this. If you've ever driven a Lexus GX 460 or 4Runner Limited with the, 4Runner Off-Road with the KDSS system, it handles absolutely flat and amazing when it's on road. It is something that you just can't, you can't articulate. It's so good, because the sway bars are so fat on such a fat vehicle that you can't believe how flat it handles for what it is. So again, this is going to be one of those type of fine-tuning type of things, but as far as on-road feel goes versus the SDM system. But in a nutshell, this is the more expensive, sophisticated system. And if we're just talking off-road, again, it disconnects in the rear, so it's the better system for off-roading as well. Now, eventually, someone's going to do some mental gymnastics and say this SDM system is superior to e-KDSS. But jumping back and going and reviewing the SDM system compared to what you just saw, the first thing that comes to your mind is how rudimentary and basic this system is versus e-KDSS. It is a more simpler, cost-effective system. You just have this thing highlighted in red, and that's it. It's a much more simpler, cost-effective system. And I'll go ahead and say it again, keep it real, and just say this is a junior e-KDSS system or a bargain e-KDSS system. Why Toyota didn't put this again on the rear is beyond me. I will reiterate again, the on-road dynamic here is going to be not as good as a system with e-KDSS, because the sway bar, theoretically on this system, they could make the front sway bar nice and fat. The only issue, honestly, is the limitation of this mechanism. So again, I don't know how big this sway bar is. The brilliant thing about e-KDSS and KDSS is, since the end links were controlled, you could make the bar as fat as you wanted. The question here is, how much torsional clutching can this mechanism handle versus the thickness of the bar? In other words, is there a limit to how fat they can make this bar before this mechanical clutch unit can't handle it anymore, or it just, it can't wear very well? You get what I'm saying, before it can't handle it. That's a question that's completely theoretical. But let's just argue and say, okay, they can put the same type of fat, thick sway bar in this system than they can on the Landcruiser 300 and the the Lexus GX 550 that you just saw with e-KDSS. So they have a nice fat sway bar in the front, so that'll make this thing handle nice and flat on road. And the answer, of course, is not so, because you're missing that same effect in the rear here, both on and off road, if that makes any sense. Additionally, you're not going to have those two independently collapsible front cylinders that can fine-tune your on-road performance. And who knows what it does front to rear. The e-KDSS system, Toyota keeps boasting that in certain situations it will keep the front on and the rear off, and vice versa. So who knows? Now, what does this mean in practical? Let's wrap it up here. What are the practical takeaways of this? They're both great systems, but we'd be lying if we say this is superior or more refined. It will do the job just fine off-road, but you cannot. The elephant in the room here is right here. We have a front disconnect and no rear disconnect. That's the elephant in the room, number one. Okay, so you can't argue that this thing in the rear is going to articulate better than the e-KDSS system in the rear. Just won't. Unless Toyota went all out and they removed the rear sway bar on this, in which case then they would articulate the same as this would articulate the same as a system with e-KDSS. I hope that rambling made sense, but who knows if Toyota on the Landcruiser 250 remove the rear sway bar. They could have, but again, this is purely speculation. We're just having fun here. By the way, if you're here for some reason still, please hit like and subscribe. But for the overall package, e-KDSS is your answer. That's why Toyota put it on their flagship Landcruiser 300 in the world market, and that's why they're putting it on the new Lexus GX 550, which they're very proud of. So Toyota had a choice here, and they chose cost savings on this new Landcruiser with this SDM system that you're seeing. But I was wrong in assuming that this was e-KDSS. But I'll say it again, it's a little bit worse, because I thought this was going to be just front e-KDSS in the front on this SDM system, in which case, you would have got those, again, independently collapsible two front cylinders. All right, I've rambled enough. If you found this video helpful, please remember to like and subscribe. Thank you, and have a great, great day.